What in the world can help the church? Where in the world should we start to search? Why in the world are we prone to lurch back and forth from perch to perch? What in the world can give us hope to widen our vision and broaden our scope when we're at the end of our rope and tempted to wallow and wither and mope? What in the world? Where in the world? Who in the world? Who in the world? What in the world can help the church?
Hi, Holy Posters, and welcome to the second episode of our special series based on the book Inalienable: How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church, co-authored by Eric Costanzo, Daniel Yang, and Matthew Soerens. In this episode of What in the World, we're exploring part 2 of the book about the image of God. What does it mean for us to see one another as image bearers? How does that impact our view of non-believers, our enemies, and even the poor? And what happens when we exchange the true God for an idol, a false image of God? My guest today is Vinoth Ramachandra from Colombo, Sri Lanka. Before entering ministry, Ramachandra earned a doctorate in nuclear engineering from the University of London. But in 1980, he returned to Sri Lanka to develop a Christian university ministry. He currently serves on the senior leadership team of the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. His multifaceted international ministry includes promoting among students and professors a holistic dialogical engagement with the world of the university, and helping Christian graduates act with Christian integrity in the face of the social, cultural, and political challenges where they are in their national contexts throughout the world. He's the author of several books, including one that comes up repeatedly in my conversation with him, Gods That Fail: Modern Idolatry and Christian Mission. After my conversation with Vinoth Ramachandra, I'll be joined by Daniel Yang and Eric Costanzo, two of Inalienable's authors, to debrief. Daniel Yang is the director of the Church Multiplication Institute, and Eric Costanzo is an SBC pastor and teacher from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, here's my conversation with Vinoth Ramachandra. Vinoth Ramachandra, thank you for being here. Welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
You have an extensive knowledge and have written broadly about this issue of the image of God and idolatry, which is a major theme in the book Inalienable, which I want to talk to you about. To begin with, and this may sound sort of basic, but I think so many of us have encountered this idea of idolatry, but we've never really given a clear definition of what we mean by it. So in your theological understanding, how do you define an idol?
Well, the simplest definition is an idol is a God substitute. Anything that takes the place of God in our lives, the one that we give our ultimate devotion to, our ultimate loyalty to, that is an idol.
And in the Old Testament especially, idolatry is spoken of in the form that you might see it in Sri Lanka, or the way I've seen it in India, which is there is a literal idol, an image of a deity to which people pray or devote themselves. But what is the broader biblical understanding of idolatry, and how do we see that transition in the New Testament in the way that it's applied?
Well, even when it comes to material idols, the more philosophically sophisticated Hindus would say it's not the physical image itself that we worship, but what the image represents. It's a certain concept of God that we worship. And so even in the Bible, we find many examples where people have a very distorted view of God. For example, a God who is going to grant them individual prosperity, and a God who is indifferent to injustice, a God who can be placated by animal sacrifices. That would be an idol, because that is a false God, a false conception of God.
And in your works on this, I think in your book, Gods That Fail, you talk about how our devotion to an idol ends up recreating us in its image. Can you unpack that? What do you mean by being recreated in the image of an idol?
Well, what we interact with in our worship shapes us. So if we're interacting with things that are less than human, less than us, it dehumanizes us. So, for example, if we worship our technologies, we end up being shaped by technology. We become more mechanical in our responses we treat other human beings as artifacts or commodities, and not as people who are of equal worth and people to whom we owe respect and for whom we have a responsibility of care. So that's just one example of how what we worship actually shapes our humanity.
Which inversely is the reason why we ought to worship the true creator God, because in the process we then take on more of his qualities and aspects and character, which brings flourishing and goodness. I think a lot of us don't have much difficulty identifying idols in other people's cultures. Even as I think about the American church, we have a pretty good ability to identify broader American cultural idols. Where things get more difficult is identifying the idols that we're very, very close to, including the idolatries that exist within the Christian community. Again, I know you've talked about this and written about it in various places. What are some of those idols that you think hide within our churches, within our Christian communities, that we may not recognize because we're so close to them?
The only way that we recognize our idols is by being exposed to people of another culture who help us to see our blind spots. So every time I visit the US, I find myself asking, supposing I were a thoughtful non-Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, an atheist, and yet I'm searching for God. I want to know, where do I find authentic Christianity? Where do I go? There's such a multiplicity of churches, all claiming to possess the truth, not in any kind of relationship with each other. And so this division, this fragmentation confuses us. Where is real truth to be found? So I think that one of the idols that is pretty obvious to those who come to the US is the sort of rampant individualism which we have imported from the wider culture into our churches. And so we end up worshipping a God who, in a sense, is just like us, a God who doesn't disturb us, who shakes us out of our comfort zones, forces us to relate to people who are different to us and to accept them as equal brothers and sisters in Christ. So I think the lack of any unity, reconciliation amongst Christians speaks of a different gospel that the American church believes in and preaches around the world. For me, unity, reconciliation is central to the very gospel that Jesus proclaimed, because the church should be the place where, as Paul puts it in Ephesians 2, Christ is breaking down these dividing walls that keep people apart. In his day, he refers to Jews and Gentiles, but wider, all ethnic groups, all cultures. The church is, or should be, presenting to the wider society an image, a picture, a foretaste of God's new humanity, that this is God's purpose, to reconcile all peoples to himself through the life and the death and the resurrection of his Son.
There's no doubt that individualism is a massive idol in the American culture, and certainly in the American church, that is manifest in our divisions and disunity. How does unity and reconciliation manifest itself in the Sri Lankan church where you are? If an American came to your context, what would we be struck by that would expose our own idolatry of individualism?
Well, here we have multiple languages that are spoken, unlike in the American church, where most people, apart from maybe Hispanic churches, and do speak and understand English, at least as a second language or a third language. We don't have that in Sri Lanka, and much less in countries like India, where over 2,000 languages are spoken. So I can understand churches which are separate on linguistic grounds, but even there, in local areas, there are efforts to bring people from different language groups together in some occasional public act of worship or service. The churches that don't do this are often churches that are influenced by American evangelicalism through the internet or through the heavy marketing programs of American cult televangelists, were very influential in South Asia and especially in Africa and Latin America. So sadly, a lot of so-called evangelical churches in our part of the world are importing these individualistic gospels, individualistic understandings of discipleship from the American church, which is ironic because the American church is not having any significant impact on American society, and yet is exporting its particular evangelical products all over the world, as if, these were what we needed.
Well, we are very good at marketing our idols, that's for sure. One of the things you mentioned there was the influence of American televangelists and megachurch pastors that are marketing their wares around the world, which brings up another one of our idols, and that is the American church tends to make celebrities out of its leadership, especially its more charismatic, dynamic speakers and highly effective institutional leaders in the church. The challenge there is the scriptures do call us to honor our leaders and to respect them and even submit to them. How do we avoid taking a good thing like the leaders that God has blessed his church with? How do we avoid making them into idols?
Well, by always exercising critical submission, whether it's political authorities, whether it's church leaders. I mean, our submission can never be passive, uncritical, because our ultimate authority is Scripture. That's what evangelicals profess anyway. But in practice, they often read the Scriptures through the spectacles that their favorite pastors or preachers give them. And that is why I see this connected with the individualism and the fragmentation of American Christianity. Because if you're only reading the Bible through the lenses that your favorite preacher or pastor has given you, and you're not associating with Christians from other churches, other theological traditions, you remain imprisoned in your blind spots. You cannot really see what Scripture may be telling you. So that is why I think all these are connected: authoritarianism, individualism, the lack of a doctrine of reconciliation. They're all interconnected.
Absolutely. Explain more the connection you see between idolatry and injustice. You mentioned earlier that when we worship these idols, we become like them, and it dehumanizes us, which leads to the dehumanization of others. Explain how false worship of false gods then permeates or metastasizes into further injustice on the social level.
Well, it comes back to what you mentioned earlier about the image of God, because the basic understanding of the image of God in Genesis 1 is that human beings, irrespective of age or gender or ethnicity or color, in some way represent God on the planet Earth. So the implication is that the way that we relate to our fellow human being is indicative of our relationship with God. We cannot claim to be worshiping God if we treat our fellow human being unjustly. We neglect them, we ignore their needs. And so the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of our relationship with God and our relationship with our fellow human being can never be separated. And that is why in the Bible, the worship of God and social justice are interconnected, intertwined. And so the whole weight of the prophetic condemnation many times of Israel, if you read all the prophets in the Old Testament, they connect their denunciation of idolatry with their exposure of social injustice, particularly neglecting the plight of the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. They are the archetypical poor, the people who are pushed to the wall when economically things get difficult. And so the way that Israel was called to show its distinctiveness, to show the difference of its understanding of God, its difference from the other nations, was that Israel was called to care for the weakest members of humanity, the downtrodden, the oppressed. And that was the index of whether they were worshipping God aright. Where they neglected to worship God, they neglected the poor. And where they neglected the poor, they neglected God.
Yeah, the link is often lost, I think, in a lot of American believers. We just don't see that connection yet. It's all over the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, that when we worship a false image of God, it causes us to neglect the true images of God, who are people made in his image. One of the things that has come up a lot in the American church in recent years is there's a segment of Christianity that is accusing parts of the American church of actually making an idol out of social justice. They're saying that too many Christians are focused on reconciliation, racism, poverty, and other forms of exploitation, and they're neglecting the gospel. They're turning away from true worship of God because they're so devoted to social activism. How do you respond to that as an outsider when you see or observe those kinds of battles going on in the American church between the proclamation of the gospel on one hand and social justice on the other, when they're split apart and one side's accusing the other of idolatry?
Well, I find them quite meaningless because it comes back to what I mentioned earlier. What is the gospel? What is this good news that people want to proclaim? And if it is an individualistic, even a privatized gospel, something like, having a private relationship with God or going to heaven when I die, then obviously how we treat our fellow human being, our political attitudes, how we spend our money has no relationship at all with the gospel. And we can live that sort of compartmentalized life. But if we go back to the Gospels and read what Jesus announced, the coming of God's reign, his kingdom, the dawn of a new world order, a new humanity, in which the powerful were pulled down from their thrones, the rich were sent empty away, and the poor lifted up, the Magnificat, Mary's song, for example, then you can never separate the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom from the practice of justice and compassion towards the downtrodden, the oppressed, the broken, because God is in the business of healing this broken humanity and bringing about a new human race. And so we can never separate our proclamation of the kingdom with our living out of the kingdom. People must see the gospel embodied in our lives as a church. Otherwise, they don't hear it, however much we may preach. And I think that is why the American church lacks any sort of credibility, and especially with young people, because they can see the hypocrisy. They can see the double standards, that what is preached about God is not actually lived out. We cannot speak of a God of compassion, a God of justice, when we ourselves are not practicing compassion and justice.
Amen. We've talked about the obvious problems with idolatry and the injustice that it foments and the destruction it brings. Explain from your point of view, what is the appeal of idolatry? Why is it this persistent, ever-present human temptation, going all the way back to Genesis 3, throughout the whole scriptures and all of human societies, and to this day, we see it everywhere. What is it about us and what's the false promise, perhaps, that idols make that draw us into their orbit?
Well, in Romans 1, Paul identifies idolatry as the fundamental sin. It is the turning away from the Creator to what is created. And it is treating the created order as if it were God. And ultimately, that is a mystery. Why should we do this? Why should we rebel against God? Why should we reject his good purposes for us and turn to things that are less than God? Ultimately, there is no answer to that. That is the mystery of evil. So this tendency of wanting to sort of put ourselves in the place of God as if we were the center of things or our creations, and to let our lives turn around them, that is the very essence of sin. to which the gospel is, God's answer.
In the book, you're quoted as saying the only effective antidote to this idolatry is a vision of the one who, having all power at his command, humbled himself and embraced the role of a lowly servant to unmask and dethrone the powers that have ravaged his world. Go further into that. How does the cross and how does Jesus' self-surrender of power give us the antidote to idolatry?
Well, because this is again the radicalness of the Christian gospel, isn't it? And there is nothing like this in any of the religious literature in the world. Of a God who is the creator of all things, coming amongst us as a humble servant, stooping to wash the feet of his disciples, and then be tortured and crucified. That was the most humiliating, the most shameful form of execution in the Roman world. And for the early Christians to go around the Roman Empire saying that if you want to know what the creator of the universe is like, you need to go and look at that battered, broken body that is hanging on a Roman cross. The only people who were crucified then were enemies of the state, terrorists, robbers, bandits, rebellious slaves. This is such a politically subversive message because it says that ultimately you will not find God in politics. You will not find God even in religion, because the people who crucified Jesus were deeply religious. You will find God there amongst the crucified nobodies of the world, the powerless, the helpless, the insignificant, because that is where God has chosen to be. That is with whom he has chosen to identify himself. So that is a countercultural vision in every culture. And it therefore shatters all the idols of nation, of religion, of tribe, of power politics, of wealth, everything that we think is ultimately, all conquering, all victorious. And the gospel says no, they are exposed as enemies of God, and they will be defeated one day.
It seems like in that answer is also the appeal of idolatry. Most idols offer us a sense of power, of control, of significance, of status, of me or my group or my tribe being dominant over others. It's everything that the cross undoes. So at its core, when I look at the challenges facing the American church, it feels to me like part of it is all rooted in the fact that we just don't want the cross. We don't want this God who calls us to the bottom, and all these idols are inviting us to maintain control and power at the top. So is the idolatry of the American church at its core a rejection of the gospel itself?
Well, yes, I agree. But it's not only power, Skye, it's fear, isn't it? And that's what makes us run to idols. We want a place of safety, of security. We feel threatened by what we don't understand. We feel threatened by the unknown. We feel threatened by people who appear as strange, alien to us. Different appearances, different habits, different ways of life. And so we retreat and we stay with people we are familiar with. We build walls, fortresses behind which we can live and practice a safe religion. And I think that is what has happened with the American church. That is why it's fragmented. That's tribalism. So it's not only power, I guess a lot of it is just fear. The fear
Indeed.
to venture out, to venture into the unknown. So a lot of evangelism is inviting people to come to our meetings and our church services rather than going to where people are and exposing ourselves to them, to their questions and their criticisms and their fears and their hopes and so on, and then learning to relate the gospel relevantly to their situation.
Well, to that end, in exposing ourselves to where the people are and to the challenges they're facing, one of the themes we see strongly throughout both the Old and New Testaments are that those who confront the people about their idols usually face a very violent response. Thinking of Jeremiah confronting the people of Jerusalem on their idolatry, numerous Old Testament prophets did this. Jesus, of course, confronted the Jewish leaders about their idolatries. Paul, in his missionary journey throughout different Greek cities, confronted the idolatries and was stoned or driven out or imprisoned in different ways. How do we faithfully, as ministers of the gospel, as leaders, as evangelists, as just teachers, how do we confront the idolatries of our culture faithfully, but also in a way where people can hear and receive what we are saying?
Well, I think it begins with public confession of our own idolatries. That is what would attract people. And I long to see evangelical bodies in America. You think of organizations like the the National Association of Evangelicals, or some representative bodies publicly confessing the idolatries of the American church before they start exposing the idolatries of the wider nation. So it's always from a posture of humility, repentance, self-criticism that we can confront others. It has to be truly a dialogical enterprise. We have to be inviting others to also tell us the things that we need to repent of, as well as trying to help others repent of what we see as their sins.
Certainly, it's what Jesus commanded in the Sermon on the Mount, where we are to look at the log in our own eye rather than the speck in our brother's. The challenge with that in the American church context, as I see it today, is there are wide segments of American evangelicalism that simply doesn't have a vision for its own idolatry, doesn't understand the communal dynamic of that idolatry, because they say, well, I personally am not guilty of this sin or that sin, therefore why am I being included? So we have these barriers set up against that kind of repentance in the American church. We tend to allow it for individuals to do that, but the church as a whole doesn't seem equipped to do that kind of repentance. Is there any way to get us a step or two closer to it in your mind?
Well, again, it comes back to this sort of false anthropology that is there in the church, this individualism. It's very strange that when it comes to, for example, I inherit my parents' wealth, or I inherit my parents' intelligence. So if they're professionals, then it's very likely that I will go to college and get a good middle-class professional job. So I benefit so much from what my ancestors have been and done. But when it comes to sin, to the evils that they have done, I shake off all responsibility and say, no, I didn't do that. That's what my ancestors did. That is hypocrisy, and we should say so quite openly. We are connected with one another in groups, in societies. And if we are aware of institutional evils, structural or systemic evils of which my family, my ancestors have been part of and contributed to, then if I'm not publicly distancing myself from that evil, exposing it, challenging it, then I'm complicit in it and I'm guilty. That's what we need to be saying.
Indeed. Well, Vinoth Ramachandra, thank you so much for your contribution to this book. Thank you for the works you've done elsewhere. If people want to read more about your thoughts on this, I can't recommend enough your book, Gods That Fail, Modern Idolatry and Christian Mission. I think there's been an updated version of that book, but it's been out for a while, and it's such a thoughtful and beautiful exploration of these themes as they relate to both secular society and its idolatry, as well as the idolatry that exists within the church, and how that creates unique challenges for mission in this day. Thank you for your outsider's voice speaking into the American church. As you said, we need to listen to our sisters and brothers in other contexts and get into different contexts to see our own idolatries. And you've helped us do that today. So we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Skye.
This episode of The Holy Post is being brought to you by our friends at World Relief. Whether you've been a part of the Holy Post audience for a long time or just recently started listening, you know that we do not shy away from taking on really heavy topics, and there have been no shortage of those in recent weeks. After we tackle those tough issues, we often hear from you, our audience, about what you can do to help. You're concerned over what's going on in the world and the crises both here at home and around the globe. And one of the questions we get consistently is which organizations to partner with in these challenging times. I know that many of you are compelled by your love for Christ and the biblical call to justice, and you want to put an end to the cycles of suffering that millions around the world are experiencing. Things like violence, oppression, extreme poverty, and displacement. It's so hard to know where to begin and who to trust. That's why we're excited to tell you about The Path from our friends at World Relief. World Relief is the global organization that we and our churches trust to bring sustainable solutions to some of the world's toughest problems. And The Path is World Relief's community of bold, compassionate women and men of faith who are committed to fighting back against suffering and injustice, and who are pursuing lasting change by giving monthly to World Relief. If you're looking for ways to put your faith into action, then I encourage you to join The Path. And you do that through a monthly gift at worldrelief.org/holypost. As a pathmaker, you'll be part of a like-minded global community that's committed to walking toward those who feel like the rest of the world is walking away from them. Whether it's the crisis in Ukraine, an earthquake in Haiti, or a refugee wave coming out of Afghanistan, you can trust that the Path community is already there making a difference. And you can too, by joining The Path today with your monthly gift at worldrelief.org/holypost. Eric and Daniel, welcome back. Thank you for being here. You guys have heard my conversation with Vinoth, and we're going to unpack it a little bit now and talk about what does this all mean for where we are in the American church. This is what you guys have written all about in Inalienable. Let me start with something that he said relatively early in my conversation with him. He said one of the ways that we come to recognize our idols is by engaging with people from other cultures. How has that been true in your experience? And what do you think are the idols that are most evident once we as North Americans or Americans engage people from outside our context?
I think that's certainly been true in my life, because I even indicate this in the book. I came to a realization in my early 20s that I'd had very few influences in my life up to that point who looked and thought differently than I. And in so much engagement with the global church in the last 20 years, I think it has exposed for me certainly things in my own heart and in my own lack of understanding that have been improved, but also just things that I bring back to my worship context related to how it looks to be the body and a community, and how we tend to kind of import things into our church culture that are just as unhealthy there as they are in the outside culture. And so there's certainly been times where just my engagement with people in different contexts, and that's been globally, but it's also even just been in North America, just visiting a different faith tradition, or a church that uses a different kind of liturgy or style, or a church where I'm the minority when I walk in. And it's just helped me see with a much wider lens just how wonderfully diverse the body of Christ is, but also ways that I had a very narrow view and narrow practices that needed to be improved.
Yeah, I
Go
was
ahead,
going to add
Daniel.
to that, like the two thoughts that came to mind when Vinoth said that was, one, when I went to Canada to plant churches. In my head, I thought Canada was very similar to the United States. In some ways it is. But I was confronted with like my nationality as an American, like at every corner in every conversation. And I realized that regardless of how I felt about, my separation between nationality and my relationship with Jesus, like others perceive those two things to be one and the same. And that for me was kind of like jolting at first, but at the same time, I think it was a real experience. Like had I not spent time in Canada, I don't think I would have realized how much I was perceived as an American Christian. Like that isn't like a adjective to the word Christian. Like American Christian is like one label. And then secondly, when he said that, what I was reminded of is, and there's a point in the book where we write about how oftentimes we will export, and he actually mentions this as well, but American evangelicalism around the world, and then you see it take place and it's reflected back to you. And you're kind of like, oh, that looks a little bit weird. I remember Alan Harris telling this story about going to Africa, and he was asking them questions about, like, why your church buildings, why do they have steeples, and they said, well, that's how the buildings were built by the Europeans. And he's like, well, the reason why they build those buildings is because of snow. You all don't have snow here. And so it was a reminder that, like, when we enter into other cultures, there's a reflection. There's almost like a mirror that we get to kind of look at ourselves. And we ask ourselves, do we like the way that we look?
When you mentioned going to Canada and seeing the differences, I'm thinking back to one of my first times traveling to Canada as a speaker, as a Christian speaker. I mean, I've been there as a kid numerous times or different areas, but I remember having a conversation with some Christian leaders there, church leaders, and they were kind of interrogating me about what it's like to be an American Christian and the American cultural context. And I mentioned to them this idea, kind of in passing, of American exceptionalism. And then I kept going, and they're like, whoa, time out. What do you mean by American exceptionalism? And I started kind of unpacking that doctrine of culture and politics and, history and all that. And they were looking at me aghast. Like, they said they'd heard that term before, but they always thought it was a joke. And I had to explain to them, no, this is a real thing. Like, people really genuinely believe this. And they just could not understand how on earth that fits with the church and Christian faith and all. So yeah, it is sometimes just having to get outside of your culture and explain your culture to someone else, and to hear it in your own ear. You're like, yeah, this is insane. This can be kind of ridiculous, but it's a really healthy practice. Toward that end, what fears do you think keep people from that kind of engagement? I mean, the three of us have probably benefited greatly from traveling a lot and engaging with people in different contexts, but Eric, even as you said, engaging with people here in the U.S. from different traditions is a valuable thing to do as well. But a lot of people don't do that. And I don't think it's just because of convenience, but there's a fear in that, right? There's a sense that if I'm exposed to something that challenges me, it threatens what it is I believe and how I practice it. How do we begin to move people beyond that fear?
I actually dealt with that yesterday morning in my Sunday message, just the weaponization of the term faith over fear, and how people used that during the pandemic and continue to use it in a very condescending way. But we happen to be in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus is addressing, do not worry about your life, do not worry about tomorrow. And the reality is we all have something that causes us anxiety. And typically when we're dealing with worry or anxiety or fear, it brings out some of the worst things in us. So I've tried to live with some grace towards that, but I've certainly seen that fear drive a lot of the pushback that I've experienced, and that even I've seen our church experience when we are engaging with, for example, our refugee neighbors. Things like that. There's the fear of but I've heard this or I've heard that, but I think even below that is the fear of, like you said, Skye, pushing back against things that I'm holding on to really tightly, that I think or believe. And what's going to happen if that changes, or I admit I'm wrong, or what's going to happen if is everything going to fall apart around me if I start to kind of dip my toe in this other area. And even when people feel kind of that cognitive dissonance with something, and as they're reading scripture, or hopefully they're, trying to follow Jesus more closely, they'll push back against it and resist it, because it's right now there's just so much fear driving, I think, kind of that white knuckled holding on to things that I've thought or I've been told from a particular source.
Right. Daniel, anything on your end of ways you've seen people overcome this fear that allows them to then engage in different communities or hear from different Christian voices?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are, global citizens in your immediate neighborhood and vicinity, and I think that it's so important to normalize having people that are different from you at your dinner tables, in your homes, sitting on the front porch with you and learning their stories, their narratives. And it has to be that personal connection in order to disarm like your preconceived notions about like their, so for instance, I mean, Muslims for a long time were kind of fell in this category. I think after 9/11, there was a fear of Muslims in the United States. And to a large degree, there still is. Lifeway did a research study, and it was higher amongst pastors than it was their parishioners, which is interesting.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And but you begin to realize that, like, when you have conversations with your Muslim neighbors, what they don't realize is that Muslims and evangelicals have actually a lot in common when it comes to how they think society should operate. These conversations really are most meaningful when they're in the home, when they're happening in, the context of children, raising families. And I think once we can like overcome that basic obstacle of walking across the street, knocking on somebody's door, then some of the other bigger walls begin to come down.
One of the things in my experience that I don't know if it's hard to think beyond my immediate context, but I do wonder if we're losing this, is there's just fewer and fewer shared cultural spaces where we interact with people that are different from ourselves. And one of the places that it's happened a lot for me in my household has just been the public school system. That's where or even youth sports for that matter, that's where we are engaging with neighbors, with other kids who come from different faith backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, different religions altogether. But if you don't engage in those specific environments, at least in my suburban area, you'd have to be like ultra intentional to find people that are different than yourself. Whereas you just dump into the public school system or into some of the, park district sports, things like that. But as Christians vacate those areas, sometimes for legitimate reasons and good reasons, it becomes that much harder to find people who are different. They might be living 2 doors down from you, but you don't actually have the social space that you engage with one another anymore. Are you seeing that in any of your communities? Is it breaking down, or is it just my perception?
Going back to your previous question, I think in our church, we've seen that engagement happen through the public school system, and our area where our church is located is a suburban area. Our metro area is about 1 million people, but we're kind of the neighborhood that was the destination of white flight and has been for like the last 30 years. So we're a majority white area, very wealthy area, but our schools also have excellent English programs for international students. And so most of our immigrants and refugees also live in our neighborhood. And so we've taken really intentional steps to have that cultural engagement in our church and in our schools. And I think that's where we've seen the most progress with a lot of our church members and their walls and barriers kind of coming down. Though you have a lot of people who they do appreciate facts and figures, we're also in a time where a lot of people are not really apt to change their minds. And so you can throw good data at them all day long, but it's not nearly as impactful as the personal engagement and meeting a person like a living, breathing human being in front of you who comes from a different part of the world, who has the word refugee associated with their situation, and seeing that they also are kind and they love their children and their child plays soccer with your child and things like that. And that has created, those spaces have been created within our community. And my experience is that in most communities, you can find that kind of cross-cultural engagement, but you do probably have to take some steps to go looking for it.
One of the things that Vinoth talks about, I think, which contributes to, the erosion of social spaces, was individualism, which is very, in some ways, it was documented quite well in the book Bowling Alone with Robert Putnam, came out in 2001. He makes very similar arguments to what Vinoth says. I think he said, some of it was because of the transition to double career families. So both mom and dad are working. And then he said a large part of it was also the suburbanization and commuting, a little bit of what Eric, you just mentioned there with white flight. But then he says, a lot of it is due to individualism, which is caused by things like media. So television, internet, those things that are replacing social spaces. And so you get entertainment from like an individual session watching TV or browsing the internet. And I think that's really interesting. I pull that back and I kind of compare it to maybe where Vinoth is coming from, Sri Lanka and other parts of the world that, I've traveled to. And I do think that there is a very real effect of how like technology and modernization over time kind of works against social spaces, whereas in more kind of agrarian societies, you still depend quite a bit on collective, effort in order to till the fields or something to that effect. And I think that like we've fully kind of imported that into our churches as well. And so the advent of, and I'm not hating on live streaming churches, but the advent of that form of participating in church life potentially continues to erode at, those social spaces.
I agree completely. I mean, being a kid in the 1980s, and you guys might be old enough to remember this as well, there was sort of a guilting of families that used to watch television at night together. And I remember my mom trying this briefly, like, we need to have dinners as a family around a table. And it rarely happened because we were so fractured, but we could watch TV together. But that was seen as like a failure of the family. Now, with 3 teenagers, I feel like if I can get all of my family in one room watching the same screen, that's a victory. We have so moved the goalposts instead of everyone just being on their own device watching their own media. But yeah, we have so fractured ourselves. Forget outside in the community, but just within our own households. Okay, last question on my end, unless you guys have other stuff you want to talk about. Vinoth talks about, and he's not the only one, but many have observed this, that we end up becoming like the idols that we worship. We take on their values and their perspectives. One of the rising recognized idols that's occurring in the American church right now is the idol of Christian nationalism. What malforming effect do you see that having? What values of Christian nationalism, which are antithetical to Christ and his gospel, are you worried about really taking root within Christian communities and Christian believers today?
Well, yeah, I'll say this, and I don't want to throw out names just to throw out names, but a few weeks ago, it was somewhat disturbing to see Michael Flynn say something to the effect that pastors that are faithful should be preaching the Constitution, and I think he said something to the effect like 85% of the Constitution is biblically based or something like that. And I'm sure he could nuance that statement in a lot of different ways to make it less nationalistic. But I think the reality is that like there's a market for that in America, and I've never been immersed in that market, and I guess I was somewhat naive thinking that like that was a small market, but I mean, you're seeing these huge rallies. I mean, CPAC just happened, a couple of days ago, and you're seeing these huge, like, momentum building movements that are driven by, Christians, and I used to feel very comfortable with the phrase God and country. Like, I mean, I don't see anything wrong with, being for God and country, but I almost have a personal fear that like there's a conflation of those of us who have this, this kind of a biblical understanding of patriotism and this push to, in a sense, create a theocracy, and not just a theocracy around biblical Christianity, but the theocracy around cultural American Christianity. And so I do think that, what Vinoth was saying, if we worship country, the form of Christianity that you're going to get is a very Christian nationalistic version.
Eric, what about in your context? What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, I'm in a Southern Baptist context. I think you knew that. I hope that I'm still allowed to talk on the podcast, but I jokingly say that because we're just such a mess in so many areas right now. And that's been really hard for me personally, because there are many aspects of the mess that we've been in the last decade that they certainly don't fit me. And I don't believe they fit in most ways my church, my local church. But this Christian nationalism thing has risen up as a major topic in the last 2 weeks. I mean, it's been a topic for a while. We address it in our book, but we've got Southern Baptist leaders now saying maybe Christian nationalism is not so bad. It's better than alternatives, and that, Daniel mentioned CPAC. There are some of these political minded conventions and rallies that really are used to, at least in my mind, appeal to the fringes, like the very radical fringes. But a lot of our folks who are trying to get reelected are, I guess, seeing that appealing to the fringes is to their benefit. And so now we see that some of our church leaders are participating in those activities. And I mean, the further extreme it gets, especially in our context to the extreme right, the further away it gets from anything that can have a strong biblical foundation. And yet some of our most prominent leaders, even heading up some of our institutions, are participating more. So I don't know what that's going to look like, but that certainly affects me in my local church context. Even though Christian nationalism is never going to be heard in my church from the pulpit, I don't know what's being said in all 35 of our small groups, and I pick up on things and I hear things, and it's tough. It's really hard to separate that kind of influence from what happens at the local level, even when you're the person in leadership, one of the people in leadership. And so I think it's an incredibly destructive idol that blurs the lines between faith and the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of man. And I think it also is extremely dangerous in terms of syncretism, which we talk about in the book, something that is very common for evangelicals to denounce on the mission field, but to have a real blind spot towards when it's happening in our own context.
Well, to that end, Eric, is it a case where obviously Christian nationalism is never going to be preached in your pulpit, and there's many other faithful pastors who are not advocates of Christian nationalism, and yet they're not going so far as to call it out either. They're not standing up in the pulpit and saying Christian nationalism, and here's examples of it, is antithetical to the gospel. This is a false deity. This is idolatry. And we are called to not only have nothing to do with this, but to shun it within our Christian communities. Like, is that possible? Or is it like, forget it, you'll never last, your people will walk out? I talked to Vinoth about this when it's, the prophets often got stoned and killed for calling out people's idols. But is that where we're at? That's just what we have to do now because we have no other choice?
I mean, I've had stones thrown at me for plenty of things. And so I think when I deal with that, nobody is surprised, but I don't know how many folks it's changing their minds. I actually had to deal with this recently when one of our church leaders was just like rolling out this list of these different false gospels, and they were all pretty much what you'd probably consider more secular, left-leaning false gospels. And so I came right behind and said, hey, let's talk about Christian nationalism. And surprisingly, most of the folks in the room really weren't even familiar with what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And where it led to a complication was like the heart of the discussion was the idea of America as a Christian nation. And it's and trying to flesh that out in a way that deals with idolatry versus just, were more people Christians in the past, or were there Christian influences? It's a long discussion, Skye. So I think to get into that is more than just a blip in a sermon. It's gonna be long conversations and discipleship that help see people even identify what that idol looks like before it can be addressed.
Well, I'm grateful for leaders like you in the pulpit trying to do that, and for writers like you guys who are giving us this content to think through and even the language to discern these idols. Thank you guys for being back with me. To remind everybody, your book is Inalienable, How Marginalized Kingdom Voices Can Help Save the American Church. And for those of you listening to this, I hope the one takeaway you have is engage with people outside of your little context, outside of your tradition, outside of your ethnic or familiar narrative, and just listen and be challenged. And maybe the great benefit that comes of it is you begin to recognize some of the hidden idols that have been in your life. Thank you guys both for joining me again.
Thanks, Skye.
Thanks, Skye.
What in the World is a production of Holy Post Media. It's based on the book Inalienable by Eric Costanzo, Daniel Yang, and Matthew Soerens, and features the authors, along with me, Skye Jethani. Production by Julie Betcher and Carla Haskins. Editing by Jason Rugg. Theme song by Phil Vischer. We are especially grateful for Holy Post Patreon supporters who make productions like this possible. If you want access to more common good Christian content like this, go to holypost.com for more podcasts, articles, and resources. Be sure to rate and comment on the show wherever you get your podcasts, so others can discover smart Christian content from people who take Jesus seriously, but not themselves.